In less than a heartbeat, conditions below decks turned violent. Somewhere in the darkness, an ember, a spark, a dropped lantern, a stray flame, found fuel where no flame belonged. Black powder does not burn like timber. It flashes, turning grains into expanding gas. The blast pulse drove through oak frames and tarred seams, splintering the ship's structure from the inside. This was not a battle. There was no enemy fleet on the horizon. The royal flagship of King Hans, Denmark and Norway's monarch, pushing to reunite the Nordic crowns, the Gribshunden, was simply sitting at anchor. It is late June 1495, around midsummer. The ship lies at anchor off the coast near Ronneby in sheltered water after seeking refuge from rough weather. The ship represents the absolute apex of naval technology for its era. She's a floating castle designed not just for transport but for the projection of lethal power and diplomatic dominance. Her high superstructures tower over the water, built to house archers and early artillery, casting a long shadow over the smaller vessels of the Baltic Sea. King Hans of Denmark and Norway uses this vessel as his primary instrument of statecraft. He is traveling to a crucial political summit at Kalmar, where he hopes to secure recognition, even election, as King of Sweden, and restore a Nordic union under his rule. He is carrying a retinue of courtiers, soldiers, and a treasury of diplomatic gifts. But on this specific evening, the king makes a decision that alters the course of maritime history. He leaves the ship. Along with his closest advisors, he takes a small boat to shore, leaving the massive vessel anchored in the archipelago. The crew remaining on board maintains the watch. The ship is a complex industrial site, filled with the raw materials of early modern warfare. Lying in the dark, unventilated spaces of the hold are casks of early black powder. This substance is unstable, unpredictable, and entirely unforgiving of error. We will probably never name the exact spark. A lantern, a galley hearth that breathed outside its bounds, any stray flame in the wrong place, all it takes is one mistake. What we can trace is the sequence. The fire starts low in the hull, where tar and pitch turn timber into kindling. It climbs fast, pulling oxygen through open hatches, hunting upward through the ship's vertical maze. And when that heat reaches the powder casks, the story stops being about flame and becomes about pressure. The explosion tears through the upper decks. The structural integrity of the hull is compromised instantly. Water rushes into the breach, fighting the flames for territory. Guns, ballast, and waterlogged stores pull at the wreck as the hull gives way, dragging the broken vessel down. There's no time to organize a systematic evacuation. The crew and courtiers trapped on board face a binary catastrophe. Above them is fire, below them is the freezing water of the Baltic. An unknown number perish in the chaos. The loss is catastrophic. In minutes, the pride of the Scandinavian fleet transitions from a symbol of imperial might to a debris field on the seabed. The king watches from the shore as his flagship is consumed. The diplomatic mission is decapitated, but the monarch survives. This event creates a unique archaeological anomaly. Usually, ships are lost in storms, scattered over miles of high-energy seabed, or stripped of their valuables before they sink. The Gribshunden went down with a remarkable amount still aboard, even if some items were likely recovered soon after. The weapons, the personal possessions of the court, the currency, and the specialized diplomatic cargo all dropped about 9 meters, roughly 30 feet, to the bottom. For the next 5 centuries, the wreck site goes silent. The surface waters of the Baltic close over the scar. The location is not deep, but it is obscure. The wreck does not rot away immediately, nor does it vanish into drift. It settles into the sediment. The physics of this specific loss created a time capsule. Because the ship sank from a stationary position, the debris field is tight and contained. The fire damaged the upper works, but the explosion may have actually helped seal the lower hull, driving it firmly into the mud. The Gribshunden becomes a ghost. She predates the famous Mary Rose and the VAH saw by decades. She belongs to a shadowy period of naval architecture where the rules of ship design were changing rapidly. Yet few examples survive to tell the story. She lies in the dark, waiting for a technology capable of reading the story written in her burnt timbers. The explosion was the end of her career as a warship, but it was only the beginning of her significance as a piece of forensic evidence. The king lost a ship. History gained a perfect crime scene. It stayed that way until the 1970s when local divers off Ronneby stumbled onto an anomaly. At that depth, the seabed is usually a landscape of sand and stone, scrubbed clean by currents and winter ice. But here, massive timbers protruded from the sediment. They were not shapeless driftwood, they were hewn oak, dark and substantial, arranged in a chaotic but clearly artificial pattern. The local diving club did not immediately realize they had found a royal flagship. They simply noted the presence of mysterious, heavy wood in their logbooks and moved on. The site remained a local curiosity rather than a global headline. In most oceans, a wooden structure submerged for 500 years disappears completely. The culprit is usually biological. The naval shipworm is a mollusk with a voracious appetite for cellulose. In warm, salty waters, these organisms drill into submerged timber, turning solid oak into a honeycomb of fragile tunnels within a decade. A ship sinking in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean is rapidly consumed, leaving only metal anchors and stone ballast to mark the grave. But the Baltic Sea possesses a unique chemical defense. The water is brackish. It is a mixture of salt water intruding from the Atlantic and freshwater runoff from the surrounding Scandinavian landmass. The salinity levels in this specific region are too low to support the life cycle of the shipworm. This invisible barrier acts like a preservation field. The organisms that erase wooden ships elsewhere simply can't complete their life cycle here, so the wreck's oak stayed solid and readable. But intact wood is not an identity. The wood remained anonymous until science caught up with the find. Identifying a wreck of this age requires more than visual inspection. It demands dendrochronology. This is the science of dating wood by analyzing the patterns of growth rings visible in the timber. Every year, a tree adds a layer of growth. The width of that layer depends on the local climate, specifically rainfall, temperature, and sunlight. These patterns create a biological barcode unique to a specific region and time period. By comparing the ring patterns in a ship's timbers to master reference chronologies, researchers can pinpoint the exact year and location the tree was felled. When researchers finally extracted core samples from the Ronneby site, the analysis was precise. The oak was felled in the winter of 1482 to 83. The ring signature points to the Meuse drainage area, peaking around the region of Nieuwe Moor in present-day Belgium. That fits a ship likely built through the shipbuilding networks of the Low Countries and later acquired into King Hans's service. The old wood could be tied to the Gribshunden with confidence. The significance of this confirmation shook the maritime archaeological community. The wreck was not just a pile of lumber. It was one of the best preserved examples of a late medieval great ship ever found. It was older than the famous wrecks raised in England and Sweden by a significant margin. It sat at the intersection of two eras, a physical bridge between the Viking longship and the heavy galleons of the colonial age. The environment had conspired to save her. 33 feet should have been a grinder, waves above, ice in winter. Instead, the blast pinned the hull into the bottom, and the Baltic's low salinity kept the scavengers at bay, leaving enough intact to invite a closer look. The ship was open for inspection. However, the team faced a new problem. The wreck was not just hull planks. High-resolution sonar scans revealed something else rising from the mud, a shape that did not look like a structural timber. It looked like a face. The engineering challenge was a problem of tensile strength versus mass. The object in question was a solid block of waterlogged oak, carved into a complex, irregular shape. It weighed roughly 300 kilos, or around 660 pounds. On land, a crane could lift this load without effort. But underwater, centuries of saturation can leave carved wood fragile and unforgiving. If the lift straps applied pressure to the wrong point, the artifact would not rise. It would shear apart, leaving the historic carving on the bottom and a cloud of splinters in the water column. The target of this operation in 2015 was a carving long linked to the ship in later records. Divers were looking for the Gribshunden, sometimes also written as Griff-in, a name often glossed as a gripping dog or a griffin-like hound. They found it buried face down in the clay. The extraction required a shift in mindset from traditional salvage to forensic excavation. Forensic excavation is a discipline distinct from treasure hunting or commercial recovery. In a salvage operation, the goal is to bring the valuable material to the surface as quickly as possible. In forensic excavation, the process is the product. The goal is to dismantle the site layer by layer without destroying the context of the debris. Every object is a piece of evidence in a cold case. The position of a timber tells a story about the force of the explosion. The location of a gun carriage reveals the battle readiness of the crew. When applied to a heavy object like a figurehead, this method demands zero tolerance for error. The object must be supported across its entire surface area during the ascent. The team rigged the artifact with specialized lifting bags. These are not simple balloons, but controlled buoyancy devices that can be inflated with precision. The divers gently cleared the sediment, holding the timber captive. As the bags filled with air, the buoyancy neutralized the dead weight. The timber floated free of the seabed, hovering in the water, suspended between the gravity of its waterlogged mass and the lift of the air. Slowly, the team guided the load to the surface. As it broke the waterline, the true nature of the carving became visible for the first time in 5 centuries. It was a monster. The figurehead was a grotesque, hybrid beast with the ears of a lion and the jaws of a crocodile. But the detail that silenced the observers was in the mouth of the creature. The beast was carved in the act of devouring a human. A person's head was clamped inside the monster's jaws, screaming. This was not a decorative mermaid or a noble lion. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. In the late 15th century, a warship was designed to terrorize. The figurehead shouted the king's power to the illiterate populations of the Baltic coast. From the shoreline, it read as a moving fortress, dominance made visible before a single shot was fired. The recovery of the monster became one of the strongest, most vivid identifiers of the wreck. But the ship's identity rests on converging lines of evidence: the site, the construction, the dating, the historical record, not on a single ornament alone. And in this era, figureheads could project power and symbolism without mapping neatly to a ship's name or owner. The wood was conserved immediately to prevent it from drying out and warping. The face of the Gribshunden had been saved, but the monster was only the ornament. The true engineering revolution lay in the hull that trailed behind it, a structure that marked the transition between the ancient and the modern world. The figurehead was the face, but the hull was the machine. To build a leviathan like the Gribshunden, the naval architects of the 15th century had to abandon the geometry that had ruled the northern seas for 500 years. They were trapped by the limits of their own tradition. The Viking lineage of shipbuilding relied on a technique known as clinker. In a clinker hull, the planks overlap one another like the shingles on a roof, riveted together to create a flexible, light shell. This design was fast and seaworthy, but it hit a hard engineering ceiling. If a shipwright tried to scale a clinker ship up to the size of a floating fortress, the hull would lose its rigidity. It would flex too much in heavy seas, working the fasteners loose until the vessel simply came apart. King Hans required a ship that could carry heavy iron guns and a massive retinue. He needed a platform that was rigid, heavy, and motionless. To achieve this, his shipwrights leaned on a fusion of ideas: Mediterranean flush-planked frame-first practice blended with Northern European experience, circulating through the shipyards and trading networks of the Low Countries. They built the Gribshunden using carvel construction. In a carvel hull, the planks do not overlap. They sit edge to edge, flush against one another, caulked with tar and hair to form a smooth skin. This skin is nailed onto a heavy internal skeleton of massive oak ribs. The strength of the ship no longer comes from the shell, but from the frame. This shift in geometry was the industrial revolution of the maritime world. It allowed engineers to build upward and outward without fear of the hull buckling under the load. It allowed the Gribshunden to reach a length of 105 feet, a size that dwarfed the longships of the previous era. However, this new technology introduced a lethal variable into the equation. The shipwrights were operating before the invention of naval mathematics. They determined stability by eye and by tradition, not by calculation. This led to a critical problem with the center of gravity. The center of gravity is the theoretical point where the entire mass of the ship is concentrated. For a ship to remain upright, this point must be kept low, deep inside the hull. But the demands of the king pushed the weight higher. The carvel frame was strong enough to support towering castles on the bow and stern. It was strong enough to carry heavy bronze guns on the upper decks. every ton of timber and iron added above the waterline raised the center of gravity, acting as a lever arm that tried to capsize the ship. The Gribshunden represents the experimental phase of this danger. She was a narrow ship, built for speed but top-heavy with the machinery of war and status. This same push for height and firepower would later test other warships. The VAH is a textbook example, while the Mary Rose remains debated, with stability only one part of a more complex story. The Gribshunden did not capsize, she exploded. But the forensic analysis of her hull timbers reveals the extreme risks the builders were taking. The heavy framing found on the seabed proves that this was a purpose-built warship, designed to absorb the recoil of artillery that was still in its infancy. The transition from clinker to carvel was not just a change in carpentry, it was a change in the strategic logic of the state. The ship was no longer just a transport, it was a heavy weapons platform. The survival of this hull structure is the only reason we can analyze these engineering decisions today. Even after the upper works burned and collapsed, the lower hull held together long enough to settle into the seabed like a sealed vault. It protected what lay in the hold from the busy, oxygen-rich water above. And inside that vault, the mud carried a biological signature that felt impossible. The sense of smell is usually the first casualty of the underwater world. A diver breathing compressed gas tastes only the dry, metallic air of the regulator, and the ocean itself smells of nothing but salt and decay. But during the excavations of the Gribshunden in 2019, the sediment yielded a sensory data point that should have been impossible. As the archaeologists disturbed the layers of mud inside the stern of the ship, they were hit with a distinct, sharp aroma. It was not the smell of rot. It was the smell of saffron. The preservation of this delicate botanical evidence is due to the unique chemistry of the seabed. The ship settled into what is known as anaerobic sediment. In most underwater environments, the upper layers of sand are oxygenated by the current, allowing bacteria and small organisms to consume soft organic matter. Anything edible, like food stores or textiles, usually vanishes within weeks of a sinking. But the mud in the Ronneby archipelago is different. It is dense, fine-grained, and chemically sealed. Once an object is buried here, it is cut off from oxygen completely. Without oxygen, the biological clock of decay stops. The bacteria that would normally break down a peppercorn or a clove cannot function. The team faced a critical operational constraint, and it demanded the same forensic patience they'd used on the wreck itself. Standard suction dredges would inhale mud and artifacts together, smashing fragile seeds against metal grates. So they worked with surgical gentleness, low-power handheld vacuum lines, effluent routed through fine mesh sieves, every pass treated like evidence. The results changed the understanding of the mission. The sieves captured hundreds of saffron threads, black peppercorns, cloves, ginger, and almonds. These were not local crops. In 1495, saffron was worth more than its weight in gold. It was an imported luxury, brought all the way from the Mediterranean or the Middle East. The sheer volume of exotic spices made the mission unmistakable. This voyage was diplomacy, staged on a warship, a summit carried in barrels and threads. King Hans was traveling with a floating pantry designed to impress the Swedish dignitaries with his colossal wealth and reach. The preservation went beyond simple shape. When scientists analyzed the material in the lab, they found delicate botanical remains that should not have survived at all. Plant fragments and spices held in oxygen-poor sediment for centuries. That gave researchers the ability to identify many of the species with unusual confidence and to glimpse the pantry, medicine, and status symbols carried aboard a royal ship at the end of the 15th century. They found the skin of grapes and the remains of a believer's medicinal plants. This micro-evidence provides a human texture that heavy timber cannot. The carvel hull tells us how the ship was built, and the black powder magazines tell us how she died. But the spices tell us how the crew and the court lived. And the ending carries a paradox. The blast that destroyed the ship also drove it down fast, burying the pantry where time couldn't pick it clean. The king lost his spices, but history gained the genetic code of the Renaissance. The excavation proved that the most valuable data on a wreck site is often the material that looks like dirt to the untrained eye.